April 1942 Mandalay, as British, Indian, and Chinese troops struggled to assemble for the defense of this crucial Burmese city, Japanese bombers and fighters stormed from the sky virtually unopposed, raining death and destruction down on Allied troops and thousands of refugees passing through on their way to India. Mandalay, with its river port and rail links, is the key to the Central Plains and, in effect, all of Burma. For months, the Emperor's troops have been pushing to get here before monsoon season, running roughshod over the poorly equipped and weary Allied armies. The aerial attack signals the beginning of their assault against the city, and with the RAF and China's Flying Tigers having been forced to withdraw from the area, the effect is devastating. On 8 April, General Joseph Stilwell, the man charged with organizing the Chinese armed forces, arrives in Mandalay. The city is still in flames, its streets littered with dead bodies and rubble. The sight leaves Stilwell incensed. He has just returned from a meeting with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, at which he implored the Chinese leader to instruct his field commanders to reinforce the front. In refusing to do so, Chiang suggests that Stilwell could increase the effectiveness of his troops by feeding them watermelon. Stilwell knows that Chiang is not as foolish as this statement would imply. He is merely unwilling to expend Chinese troops and equipment to defend anything other than Chinese soil, even though the loss of Burma would result in the complete isolation of China. The British and Chinese fight courageously, but the enemy is too strong to be held back for long. By 29 April, it is clear the city will fall, and the Allies begin to withdraw. On 1st May, the Japanese enter Mandalay. As British and Indian troops retreat to India by truck and train, Stilwell remains behind with his Chinese divisions north of the fallen city, supervising their withdrawal. Lacking a sufficient number of trucks to make the move, when the time comes to evacuate himself and his staff, Stilwell gathers together those who are to make the journey, a group of about 100, including 19 Burmese nurses, and tells them, "Let's get the hell out of here." They will make the journey on foot. Pressing through the Burmese jungle with the Japanese still advancing behind them, the group, led by the 60-year-old Stilwell, endures insects, deadly snakes, unbearable heat, and a severe shortage of food. Vinegar Joe, who develops a case of jaundice along the way, doesn't miss a step. On 14 May, the motley group slouches into India, having trekked some 140 miles. Stilwell has delivered them to safety without the loss of a single person, yet for him there is no triumph. Burma is lost, and with it the ability to readily supply troops fighting the Japanese in China. His job has just become infinitely more difficult. So when British generals begin to wax eloquent about their glorious retreat and a heroic voluntary withdrawal, Stilwell will have none of it. His anger and frustration boil to the surface. In a statement that only serves to reinforce his salty image, he tells the press that no military commander in history ever made a voluntary withdrawal, and there's no such thing as a glorious retreat. All retreats are ignominious as hell. And as for his assessment of the Burmese campaign, Vinegar Joe is concise and to the point. I say we got a hell of a licking. March 1942. In Washington, President Roosevelt signs a directive dividing the Pacific Theater into two commands. Though it is, on its surface, purely a bureaucratic nicety, in reality, it is the result of more than a month of difficult negotiations. It has been clear since the onset of war that the Pacific would have to be split. It is an impossibly large area, from just off the coast of the Americas to the Indian Ocean, covering roughly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. But how to divide that area has been an enormous problem, involving not only international and inter-service relations, but also the enormous egos of some of the key players. It has been assumed all along that General Douglas MacArthur would have command of at least some of the region. Though he arrived in Australia as little more than a refugee, in command of nothing but the few troops able to escape the Philippines with him, he is America's senior general in the region. American diplomats suggest that the Australians nominate MacArthur to command the as yet undefined southwestern Pacific area, and they grudgingly do so, though they prefer Lieutenant General George Brett, who has long served in Australia. The American Navy, which sees the war against Japan as a largely naval conflict, loathes the idea that they might be subject to Army command. When Admiral Ernest King ascended to Chief of Naval Operations, he started lobbying for a naval commander-in-chief of the Pacific. MacArthur is not the sort to play second fiddle to anyone, however, and he and his staff begin their own forceful lobbying campaign. As the Allies engage in largely defensive action in the East, the Joint Chiefs begin secret work on a directive apportioning the Pacific. It should not be, they know, the most pressing matter they have to deal with. All are in agreement that Europe must be won before the Pacific can be fought. But it is something that must be done if the turf war is to avoid becoming more active than the war against the Japanese. The final compromise makes MacArthur Supreme Commander of the Southern Pacific, from Australia through the great island chains of the Philippine archipelago to South Asia. The bulk of the on-land fighting that will have to be done in the Pacific will be done in that area. The remainder of the Pacific, minus a small band off the coast of the Americas, encompasses more territory, but almost no land. That becomes the domain of Admiral Chester Nimitz, who is named Commander-in-Chief of the North Pacific. Not to be outdone, MacArthur immediately retitles himself Commander-in-Chief of the South Pacific. It is an honorific unrecognized by the brass back in Washington, but apparently pleasing to the general himself. The virtual destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor has forced American military strategists to completely redesign their plans for war in the region. With 6 of 8 battleships sunk and the other 2 severely damaged, the Navy now lacks what has for centuries been the primary instrument of naval power. Although the attack on Pearl was a disaster, it could in fact have been far worse. By a stroke of luck, the fleet aircraft carriers and the heavy cruisers escorting them were on maneuvers at the time of the attack. Now, by default, they have been thrust into the position of being the primary weapon available to combat the Japanese. The push to build America's carrier force began in the 1920s, driven primarily by Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. Mitchell argued that bomb-laden aircraft were capable of sinking any ship afloat. His assertions were met with skepticism by the old salts of the Navy. They contended that the only thing capable of sinking a heavily armored dreadnought was another battleship, and relegated naval aircraft to use as scout planes. On 21 July 1921, however, Mitchell made his point in dramatic fashion. After months of training, his bombers sank the decommissioned battleship Alabama. While not everyone was convinced of the future of naval aviation, the demonstration prompted the Navy to convert the USS Langley into its first aircraft carrier. Despite the fact that by 1941 the U.S. Pacific Fleet had a total of 3 carriers, there were still those who questioned their usefulness. Ironically, it took the Japanese attack to prove to these skeptics the devastating effectiveness of carrier-based aircraft. The Japanese Navy, with many pilots among its top officers, was far quicker to adopt the carrier as the principal force in its fleet. While the leaders of the U.S. Navy were wrangling over how to best employ the carrier, Japanese naval aviators were gaining invaluable experience attacking land targets in China. Along with the unqualified support of the top brass and essential combat experience, the Japanese carrier pilots also have an edge in the aircraft department. primary fighter of the Japanese Navy is the Mitsubishi Zero. It is faster, more maneuverable, and has a far greater range than the Americans' primary fighter, the Grumman Wildcat. That advantage, however, may well be short-lived. Soon to be deployed is a plane the Navy hopes will be more than a match to the vaunted Zero, the Vought F-4U Corsair. With distinctive gull-shaped wings and an enormous radial-cooled engine, the Corsair is faster and packs more punch than the Zero. Still, its effectiveness in battle is yet to be proven. In preparing to challenge the Japanese in the Pacific, American naval strategists face a daunting task indeed. With no precedents on which to base their actions, they must take the three carriers at their disposal and employ them in the most effective manner possible. They must check the mighty Imperial Navy, and at the same time learn how to effectively defend the carriers themselves. How they choose to meet these challenges, and how successful their solutions are, will undoubtedly dictate the outcome of the war in the Pacific. Across the Potomac River from Washington, a curious building is taking shape. It is a building unlike any other, both in its design and intended purpose, and will likely prove one of the enduring monuments of this war. It is an enormous monolith, a 5-story Pentagon that will be home eventually to all the American military branches. Currently, more than 40,000 Army, Navy, and Army Air Force staffers are scattered about the District of Columbia in 23 different locations. Soon they will take up residence in a new shared home that overlooks both Washington and Arlington National Cemetery. While construction crews labor on its exterior, the structure of its vastly more complicated inner workings are being decided in Washington. 9 February 1942. President Roosevelt, in an attempt to coordinate the various American military branches, establishes the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Made up of representatives of the Army, Army Air Force, Navy, and Executive Branch, the Joint Chiefs are FDR's answer to Winston Churchill's call for a centralized authority to decide war policy. As 1942 dawned, that central authority was to be the Combined Chiefs of Staff, made up of representatives of the professional militaries of England and the United States. American military planners put forward their vision of an American combined command, which would consult with the British on all major policy matters. The Navy, which feared that the envisioned supreme military commander would likely come from the more sizable Army, aggressively rejected the proposal. Roosevelt, concerned primarily that the power to set war policy stay in American hands, formulated the Joint Chiefs as a compromise. There would be a single chairman who would report directly to the president, but that chairman would be assisted by a joint Army-Navy staff, eliminating the possibility that any one branch would come to dominate defense thinking. The initial membership of what is certainly the most exclusive military club in the world is an impressive one. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall becomes chairman with direct and unfettered access to the president. Serving with him are General Hap Arnold, commander of the semi-autonomous Army Air Force, and Admiral Ernest King. A representative of the executive branch is not immediately designated, but it is widely assumed that Roosevelt's Chief of Staff, retired Admiral William Leahy, will assume that role. The newly unified American command will take up residence in the Pentagon even before construction is completed. The huge building, 5 stories tall, 1,000 feet on a side, is being built in stages that will allow occupancy of one wing, while others remain little more than foundations. The creation of the Joint Chiefs and their move into the Pentagon have implications beyond the current conflict. It is an announcement of sorts that the gutting of American power that has followed every other war in the nation's history will not follow this one. That America, as a world power, is on the scene to stay. As the world is engulfed in fiery conflicts on the land, sea, and air, another, more subtle battle is being waged for the hearts and minds of the men and women on both sides. Rather than bullets, bombs, and bayonets, the weapons employed in this struggle are more commonly newspapers, films, and radio waves. While truth may be the first casualty of war, what is true is often less important than what is believed to be true. And propagandists on both sides are working feverishly to promote their version of the truth. In its effort to gain popular support and promote national unity, the Nazi propaganda machine is unrivaled. Using regular radio broadcasts, strictly controlled newspapers, and epic filmmaking, the Reich Ministry of Information and Propaganda, under the watchful eye of Joseph Goebbels, has rallied the German people, convincing them of the supremacy of the Aryan race and their destiny to dominate the world. The Germans have not just been fed visions of Teutonic knights and vibrant young Germans frolicking in the bright alpine sun. Hitler realizes that to mobilize the entire German population for war, there must be a common enemy against which they can rally. By promoting stereotypes, the Nazis have cultivated the deep-seated fears of the German people and given them a vile enemy, a dire threat to the survival of the Aryan race, the Jew. The Nazis are certainly not alone in their efforts to sway the emotions of the populace. In the United States, a well-planned and concerted effort has been underway to influence public opinion since well before America's entry into the war. Long before Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt, through the masterful use of his fireside chats, slowly began to enlighten the American public to the growing tide of fascism in the outside world, and to convince them that it was a serious threat to them inside their homes. While the Nazis may have a more sinister goal, American propagandists have also promoted stereotypes and played on the fears of the public. The Japanese are dehumanized, referred to as Japs or Nips. They are depicted in cartoons as buck-toothed, slant-eyed warmongers. A sense of caution and mistrust is cultivated as films are shown in movie houses, alerting viewers to the evil Nazi spies lurking in the mist. While the propagandists' efforts to unify and galvanize their people have been successful, it is not the only contribution they are making to the war. An ancient Chinese sage once said that the greatest act of generalship was to subdue the enemy without any battles. And that is exactly what the propagandists are trying to do. It is hoped that by feeding the other side news, both true and false, its ability and will to fight will be diminished. The Germans did this with astounding success against the French. By spreading rumors and using radio broadcasts, the Germans sapped the morale of the prestigious French army, thus ensuring their astounding victory in June of 1940. British propagandists are actively trying to sow the seeds of discontent within the Third Reich through regular broadcasts on the BBC. Although the Nazis have total control over news sources inside Germany, they cannot block radio waves transmitted from England to those bold enough to risk the wrath of the Gestapo by tuning in. As the war continues, so does the endless flow of propaganda from both sides. While there is no way to quantify the effectiveness of these campaigns, they continue to be waged with all the vigor of any contest on the battlefield. Ironically, to the men fighting on those battlefields, who have little access to the facts, it is this very battle of conflicting truths for which they are willing to lay down their lives. April 1942, in what will surely go down as one of the most audacious raids in American history, 16 Air Force bombers operating off an aircraft carrier strike a blow on the Japanese mainland. The attack, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, is militarily insignificant, but it provides a huge morale boost to a nation in desperate need of good news. Soon after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the president and his advisors began to discuss a carrier-borne retaliatory attack on Tokyo. The problems at first seemed almost insurmountable, key among them being America's need to protect its naval forces, which were seriously depleted by the Japanese sneak attack. Any ships used in the raid on Japan would have to leave as soon as the attack was launched. The raiders would have to land somewhere on the Asian continent. Even that relatively simple act was complicated by diplomatic considerations. The Russians, fighting for their national life against the Nazis, cannot risk opening a second front with the Japanese. Whatever planes bombed Japan would have to continue into China, a distance of 1,500 miles, far beyond the range of naval aircraft. The Air Force, however, has several bombers with ranges greater than 2,000 miles. Air Force Chief of Staff General Henry Hap Arnold ordered Doolittle to assemble and train a team of volunteers. On 2nd April, Doolittle and his raiders, with barely a month's training under their belts, boarded the carriers bearing their bombers and began the long trip across the Pacific. Early on the morning of 18 April, the task force spots a Japanese patrol boat. Almost immediately, the cruiser Nashville opens fire, sinking the craft and killing all on board. There is no way to know whether the Japanese were able to send word of the approach of the American Armada. Still, hundreds of miles from their designated departure point, Doolittle is confronted with a choice: abort the mission or take off knowing they haven't sufficient fuel to reach their safe landing areas. Believing the rewards to be worth the risks, he gives the green light for the mission. Flying the lead plane himself, Doolittle has less of the runway to work with than any of those who followed. The B-25 trundles slowly forward, and as he runs out of deck, Doolittle pulls the nose of the plane sharply upward. The Navy pilots, familiar with the difficulties of taking off in such a constricted area, gasp in disbelief as the huge bombers, which normally depart from runways nearly a mile long, lift one after another into the overcast sky. As soon as the planes are off, Halsey gives the order to turn his precious fleet toward home. The planes fly low to escape detection. Each carries a 2,000-pound bomb load, a mixture of high explosives and incendiary devices. So that the loss of a plane will not turn into an intelligence bonanza for the Japanese, the elaborate Norden bomb sights normally installed in the Mitchell's cockpits have been removed. What is important, Doolittle and his men know, is not the accuracy of the bombing, but the bombing itself. The target is not a particular building or facility, but the much broader target of the Japanese nation's confidence. It takes 5 hours for the raiders to reach the Japanese coast. 13 head for Tokyo and 1 each to Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Shortly after noon, Doolittle and his raiders reach Tokyo. Coming in from the east and north, the raiders drop their bombs, hitting a random selection of urban life: a crane, a ship in dry dock, a school. The Emperor's Palace, clearly visible from the air, is not bombed for fear that an attack on the very symbol of Japanese nationalism will incite the Japanese to higher levels of aggression. Bombing finished, the planes race onward toward China. Not a single one makes it to its designated landing spot. 2 crash land behind enemy lines, their crews taken prisoner by the Japanese. Several crewmen are executed. Others struggle on, either crash landing or bailing out over Chinese territory. One, desperately short of fuel, flies against orders to Vladivostok, where the Russians, fearing reprisals by the Japanese, take the crew prisoner. Doolittle and his crew bail out and are rescued by Chinese forces. Back home, word of the raid spreads quickly. President Roosevelt publicly cites Doolittle and his men. People pour into the streets and celebrate. It is, in truth, a small victory. But for Americans hungry for something to celebrate, even a small victory seems large at the outset of what promises to be a very long war. March 1942, the Philippines. As General Douglas MacArthur is ordered by his superiors to abandon the islands for safe haven in Australia, the military situation here grows more dire, and the American command seems beset by miscommunication and confusion. As he departs, the general divides responsibility for the remaining forces among his former assistants, failing as he does so to notify Washington of the changes. The commanders in the U.S. and MacArthur then issue a series of orders that seem out of touch with reality, at least as it is being experienced by troops on the ground. MacArthur orders General George Moore, holed up on the offshore island of Corregidor, to set aside rations for troops trapped on the Bataan Peninsula. Those troops are tired, bloodied, and half-starved, but MacArthur apparently believes they will be able to fight their way through the Japanese blockade and across 2 miles of open water to Corregidor. Washington, on the other hand, sends word to the senior officer in the Philippines to hold Bataan at all costs. That message is addressed to the commander in the Philippines and is intended for General Jonathan Wainwright. But since MacArthur's restructuring of the command, there is no single commander, and Washington's message finds its way not to Wainwright, but to Colonel Lucius Beebe. The confusion dramatizes a lack of consensus by the Allied command on exactly what the future holds for the island forces. Wainwright, who has moved his headquarters to Corregidor, finds himself bickering with a resentful MacArthur over, among other things, how much food is left on Bataan. When Wainwright calls for an air raid to relieve the Japanese blockade, MacArthur refuses, saying he doesn't have enough aircraft. Conditions on Bataan deteriorate, and on 29 March, Wainwright receives a desperate plea from the peninsula. Trapped in their foxholes without food or medicine, the Army forces are on the verge of collapse. Corregidor, itself cut off from resupply, has no food to give, and the fate of Bataan is sealed. On the night of 2nd April, the Japanese launch a huge artillery barrage, blowing a hole 2.5 miles wide in the American defenses. The next day, Japanese forces pour through the breach. From Australia, MacArthur orders a counterattack. Wainwright thinks the order little more than madness, but passes it along to commanders on Bataan. On Easter Sunday, as Japanese overrun the American positions, the dilapidated army mounts a weak offensive. Major General Edward King, commander of Bataan's 1st Corps, defies orders and surrenders. Wainwright watches from Corregidor as the Japanese begin herding American and Filipino prisoners into columns for an 85-mile forced march to prisons at San Fernando. Those who fall behind are shot. Those who are found in possession of Japanese money or souvenirs are presumed to have killed Japanese soldiers and are beheaded. The Bataan Death March, one of the most disgraceful atrocities in the Pacific War, has begun. In Washington, President Roosevelt rescinds his earlier order, giving Wainwright the power, if he deems it necessary, to surrender. On the night of 5 May, Japanese troops land almost undetected on the island. The fight is a short one, and by the morning of the 6th, Wainwright orders his troops to surrender. Wainwright becomes a Japanese prisoner. For all practical purposes, organized American resistance in the Philippines has ended. May 1942, London. After 6 days of heated debate and negotiations, representatives of Great Britain and the Soviet Union conclude an agreement forging an alliance between the two nations. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, ever unafraid to straddle the diplomatic fence, had instructed his man Vyacheslav Molotov to insist that Russia be allowed to keep those areas of Poland and the Baltic states granted to it by its 1939 deal with Germany. Churchill and his man Anthony Eden balked. Unlike Hitler, they would not endorse the communist domination of Eastern Europe in order to attain their own political goals. Stalin, aware that the key to America's Lend-Lease gold mine and a second front in Europe depends on a solid relationship with England, backed off his demand. The treaty, as it stands, makes no mention of post-war territorial frontiers. For Churchill and Eden, the pact stipulating that no armistice or peace will be negotiated with Germany by either of the parties without the consent of the other provides a buffer against any possible shenanigans by Stalin, wherein he might, to save Russia, join forces with the Nazis and attack the Western Allies. For Stalin, the pact opens the door to financial and material support from the United States, as well as hope for a cross-channel assault against Hitler's Fortress Europe that would provide much-needed relief for the Red Army. In addition, the dictator notes with satisfaction, while the treaty does not explicitly bequeath him those areas of Eastern Europe he had earlier conquered, it does not explicitly deny him those areas either. April 1942, North Africa. From his headquarters in Benghazi, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel gazes east toward the positions of the British Eighth Army. Soon, he knows, the uneasy quiet welcomed by troops on both sides will be shattered as he, once again, hurls his Africa Corps eastward toward Tobruk. In the past 14 months, the pendulum has swung back and forth across the desert 5 times. The appearance of the stark landscape is made surreal by the miles of trenches crisscrossing the terrain like hundreds of tiny veins. Scattered about are thousands of burnt-out tanks, trucks, and jeeps. Grave markers stand in silent testament to the fury of the battle that has raged for this godforsaken piece of land. For the men on both sides, this brief respite from the rigors of battle is a welcome break. For months, there has been little time to relax. And now that their commanders have, for the moment, taken a pause, they intend to make the most of it. British commanders are using this time to fortify their positions for the attack they know is inevitable. Supplies pour in daily. Tanks, trucks, anti-tank guns. The Brits know they must outnumber Rommel's forces in order to make up for the Germans' superior weapons. They They fortify their positions with trenches protected by mines and barbed wire. The Germans, meanwhile, are busy fighting a supply battle of their own. The ground war in North Africa relies completely on the Nazis' ability to deliver supplies to the port at Tripoli. The British realize this all too well, and the RAF operating out of Malta is hotly contesting the Germans' control of the Mediterranean. Day in and day out, vital German shipping is sent to the bottom by marauding Spitfires. So even though there is a lull in the ground war, the chess match between the British and the Desert Fox continues. Although Rommel's supply problems are far greater than those of the British, he has one immeasurable advantage. The British commanders, who have been outgeneraled time and again, are now beginning to question themselves. They lack the confidence to make bold decisions on the battlefield, and against a sly adversary such as Rommel, indecision is the first step toward defeat. It is a sad but true fact that old men start wars and young men fight and die in them. This war is certainly no different. All the belligerents, including the United States, have asked a generation of their young men to set aside their lives and march off to an uncertain fate. While the austere, highly regimented routine of life under arms is, for the new recruits of most nations, quite foreign, for the Germans, it is a moment for which they have prepared their entire lives. Long before launching their war of aggression, Hitler and the Nazis began to indoctrinate the youth of Germany with martial training and values. In 1926, they established the Hitlerjugend, or Hitler Youth, an organization intended to educate young Germans for the good of the party. Initially a voluntary group, membership became compulsory in December 1936, and under the leadership of Baldur von Schirach, quickly became an integral part of the Nazi power structure. At age 6, young boys are required to serve an apprenticeship in the Hitler Youth. The spirit of camaraderie and the emphasis on athletics make the group extremely popular with youngsters. Along with the focus on physical activity, the boys are immersed in the National Socialists' political, historic, and racial doctrine. At age 10, after successfully completing a battery of physical and scholastic tests, the boys are allowed to join the young people's branch of the Hitler Youth. Much like the military, the boys are required to swear a personal oath of allegiance to Hitler, promising to lay down their lives for him if necessary. At age 14, the boys become full-fledged members of the organization. After 8 years of education, the boys have thoroughly assimilated Hitler's twisted theories of racial science and German national destiny. Promoting their vision of racial purity and Aryan superiority, the Nazis touted the Hitler Youth as producing young men with minds and bodies of steel. At the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, Hitler was determined to show the world that his young supermen were far better than athletes of inferior races. Much to his consternation, however, Jesse Owens, a black American, captured 4 gold medals in track, setting world records in all 4 events. Despite this blow to their worldview, the Nazis continued to exalt the superiority of the Aryan race and to instill these ideas in their children. As the time for war drew near, the training of the Hitler Youth took on a more practical military nature. Instead of marching or sports-related activities, the thinly disguised exercises and drills were preparing the young men for their coming tasks. Certainly, the astounding success of the German military in the first 2 years of the war can be at least partly attributed to the years of indoctrination and training their troops have had. Whether or not the Hitler Youth can continue to supply the German military with high-quality troops in the numbers necessary to support their far-flung armies remains to be seen. If it can, then Hitler may well realize his goal of world domination. If, however, the demand for fresh troops becomes too great, the young boys of the Hitler Youth may become nothing more than cannon fodder. For May 1942, a Japanese invasion force puts to sea its target, New Guinea. The task force is made up of 11 Army troop transports screened by aircraft carriers, destroyers, and heavy cruisers. New Guinea is key to the Japanese plan to invade Australia. It is a short hop across calm water from the island to Cape York Peninsula in Queensland, and the Imperial plan is to have troops on Australian soil by summer. As the Japanese Armada sets out, they don't realize that the United States knows they're coming. Just after the outbreak of war, American cryptologists deciphered the most secret of Japanese secret codes. Since then, Japan's most privileged radio transmissions have been theirs for the taking. Floating between the Japanese task force and New Guinea are the ships of Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Fleet. Nimitz and Admiral Bull Halsey believe that an air attack against the task force can stop the Japanese invasion before it begins. Nimitz distrusts the Army Air Force pilots and chooses instead to let the veteran pilots of the aircraft carriers Lexington and Yorktown carry the battle. Thus is a plan hatched for a completely new kind of battle, one in which great navies meet not with guns but with planes, attacking each other from far over the horizon. As the Japanese fleet sails onward, oblivious to the pending attack, a weather front swoops across the Coral Sea, befogging thousands of square miles of ocean. The heavy weather works in the favor of the ambushing American fleet, who conceal themselves until they are within 20 miles of the Japanese. Just before dawn on the morning of 6 May, the Yorktown launches Wildcats and Devastator torpedo bombers at the approaching Japanese Navy. Dive bombers pitch 1,000-pound high explosives at the enemy, damaging the destroyer Kirizuki so badly that its captain runs it aground so that it will not swamp. 3 minesweepers sink as the American planes return to their home carrier. On 7 May, aircraft from the Lexington track down the Shoho, the smallest of several Japanese carriers in the area. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch launches an attack that catches the Japanese admiral with only 7 of his planes airborne. The Japanese turn their carrier into the wind to launch more fighters, just as the American torpedo bombers approach. The Shoho, steaming straight and steady so that its planes can take off, makes a fat target. 60 dive bombers and 24 torpedo planes finish the ship in less than 10 minutes. Attacks on the larger Japanese carriers, Zuikaku and Shokaku, are less successful. The Zuikaku hides in the dark of a rainstorm. The Shokaku is not so lucky. American planes drop 3 bombs on her deck, ending her ability to mount flight operations, but she steams away before a death blow can be dealt. The Japanese, while certainly getting the worst of the first day's conflict, were not without victories of their own. Japanese aircraft sink the American tanker Neosho of the cruiser Sims and damage several other craft. The next day, 8 May, dawns clear and bright. Aircraft from the Zuikaku corner the Lexington in a crossfire of bombs and torpedoes striking both sides of the ship. As the captain orders a hard about to avoid one flight of incoming torpedoes, he turns directly into the path of another. Bombs from above explode in the ship's smokestack and in an ammunition magazine. In 19 minutes, the attack is over. The Lexington is listing 6 degrees to port. After several hours of heroic damage control, the order is given to abandon ship. 5 torpedoes from the American destroyer Phelps send the carrier once and for all to the bottom. The Yorktown, attacked at the same time, fares better. It absorbs several hard blows but continues to fight. By mid-afternoon, conscious of dwindling supplies, Bull Halsey gives the order for the American fleet to pull out of the Coral Sea. Unbeknownst to Halsey, the Japanese force is receiving much the same message from its handlers. By sundown, the battle is broken off. The Japanese invasion force and the American defenders retreat. The toll taken has been heavy. The Japanese have lost 1 carrier, 2 destroyers, 3 cargo ships, 4 gunboats, and a handful of small vessels sunk. 2 other carriers, a cruiser, and a destroyer sufficiently damaged that they must return to port for repairs. American losses are 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 1 tanker. The most important casualty, however, is the Japanese dream of conquering Australia. The invasion force never makes it to New Guinea, and without New Guinea, there will be no Imperial troops coming ashore in Queensland. The Japanese dream of conquering the entire Western Pacific has ended. May 1942, England, under the command of Air Marshal Arthur Harris, over 1,000 Royal Air Force bombers take to the air, embarking upon Operation Millennium, the objective of which is the destruction of the city of Cologne. While the purpose of the mission is to disrupt the manufacture of war materials, what may prove even more important is the steel this action will add to the will of the English people. Since the war began, the citizens of Britain have played an historic, if unenviable, role. They have been on the receiving end of a lesson in the importance of aircraft in modern warfare. As the victims of a seemingly endless series of air raids, their nights have become a hell of raging fires, destruction, and death. As the Nazis have endeavored to dominate the world, they have depended heavily on air power. Under the leadership of Hermann Goering, the ruthless and visionary head of the Luftwaffe, incessant airstrikes have pounded Hitler's adversaries into helplessness. Time and again, they have destroyed cities, blown up bridges, highways, and rail lines, and perhaps most importantly, broken the will of the European peoples to resist. The psychological impact of aerial assault cannot be overestimated. Around the world, people depend upon their country's military, first and foremost, to protect them from harm. But how can any military be reasonably expected to protect against attack from the air when only 1 plane need reach its target in order to deliver a devastating blow? This is the lesson that the people of England have been forced to learn. But now, as her citizens ship their children to safe haven in the north and stiffen their upper lips, the Royal Air Force is preparing a reply. As much as the Germans want the war in Europe to be a battle of advanced military techniques, the British are about to turn it into a battle of a nation's will and a people's determination. On the evening of 30 May, the 1,046 planes of Millennium set out for Germany in an airborne caravan 70 miles long. Early the following morning, the citizens of Cologne awaken to the sounds of war as thousands of bombs explode and set their city ablaze. The anti-aircraft guns on the ground remain unused for fear of shooting down Luftwaffe defenders who never arrive. By morning, over 250 factories are in ruins, 45,000 Germans are homeless, and all but 40 of the British planes are safely home. As devastating a blow as the bombs deliver, even more disturbing to the German high command are the weapons dropped by the last airplanes to fly over Cologne. Thousands of leaflets drift down from the sky to the smoldering city below. Addressed to the people of Germany, they state simply, "The offensive of the RAF in its new form has begun." And so, it seems, as the battle of a nation's will and a people's determination. 3 June 1942, Dutch Harbor. In an operation that is a diversion for another operation, which is itself a diversion, 13 carrier-launched Japanese fighter bombers begin an attack on the naval base here on the island of Unalaska. The purpose of this attack is to draw attention away from the planned invasion of the two most westerly islands in the Aleutian chain, Attu and Kiska. For the Americans, based on these godforsaken slabs of rock and muskeg, the actual attack is less of a surprise than the fact that anyone would want to invade these islands in the first place. Situated off the coast of Alaska between the North Pacific and the Bering Sea, they are cold, desolate, depressing atolls of misery, barely suited for occupation by human beings. Nevertheless, they are U.S. territory and, despite the consistently inclement weather, are considered by both sides a possible staging area for attack, so the military has stationed men here to protect them. The raid on Dutch Harbor is over quickly with minimal losses on both sides, and on 5 June, the Japanese land troops on Attu and 2 days later overrun Kiska. In both cases, because the American commander had assumed the Japanese objective was the coast of Alaska, the invasions are unopposed. While the location of the landings is something of a surprise, the fact that the Japanese were going to stage an attack on the Aleutians is no surprise at all. In fact, the Americans have known for weeks that the Imperial Navy was coming, having intercepted and decoded radio messages to that effect. They also know that the attack here is only an attempt to draw the bulk of the U.S. Pacific Fleet away from the real Japanese objective, Midway. So while the military leaders on both sides realize that the invasion of the Aleutians was merely a feint and that they are of little strategic or tactical importance, the government and people of the United States are outraged and demanding reprisal. Unaware or uncaring of the fact that who maintains control of these barren rocks will likely have little impact on the outcome of the war, Americans can see only one aspect of the Japanese victory here. That, for the first time in a very long time, a foreign invader is occupying U.S. soil. May 1942, Tokyo. Japanese Imperial Headquarters issues an order instructing a combined fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo to invade and occupy strategic islands in the western Aleutians and Midway Island in the central Pacific. The plan, devised by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, is an attempt to lure what is left of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a final, decisive battle. Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii, is the United States' westernmost outpost. It would provide the Japanese with an advanced base for operations against not only Hawaii, but also the West Coast. After the destruction of the U.S. fleet and the taking of the islands, Yamamoto, who fears Japan will lose a protracted war, feels certain that the United States will quickly sue for peace. The Japanese are confident of victory, and not without good reason. The fleet under Nagumo's command is enormous, including 10 battleships and 4 aircraft carriers. The Americans have no battleships and only 2 carriers, neither of which Yamamoto believes is anywhere near Midway. The Japanese belief in the lack of American naval power in the region is no accident. It is, in fact, exactly what Admiral Chester Nimitz wants them to believe. Nimitz is betting everything on the as-yet untested intelligence obtained by breaking the Japanese code, which indicates that Midway, not the Aleutians, is Yamamoto's primary objective. American intelligence has also misled the Japanese into believing that the USS Yorktown was sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. Although she is far from tip-top shape, the Yorktown, after receiving emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor, is considered battle-worthy. On 2 June, with the Japanese fleet making for Midway, 2 American task forces under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance sit in radio silence 325 miles north of Midway. With only 3 carriers, the Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, Spruance knows that if the U.S. Pacific Fleet is to survive the coming battle, he must achieve complete surprise, taking out the Japanese flat tops before they have an opportunity to effectively strike at his carriers. It is a tremendous gamble. If it pays off, it would be a devastating setback for the Japanese and perhaps a turning point in the war. If it fails, however, the Americans' ability to contest the Japanese in the Pacific will be virtually destroyed, leaving the west coast of America staring into a rising sun. As the Germany of the 1930s has gone from being a financially destitute and politically disoriented republic to the dominant force in Europe and perhaps the world, the focal point of that rebirth has undoubtedly been Adolf Hitler. Yet, as with all leaders, he has not arrived nor does he dwell at his pinnacle alone. Surrounding him are a group of men who, it might be argued, have had as much to do with the rise of Nazism and the transformation of Germany as Hitler himself. Principal among those who can claim credit for Hitler's ascent as leader of the German people is Joseph Goebbels. Functioning as the Nazis' Minister of Propaganda since 1933, he is the man who crafted the Nazi leader's image, who sold Hitler to the public, not just as a political chieftain, but as savior of the nation. After graduating with a degree in philosophy, a young Goebbels failed in a number of attempts to become a novelist or writer, turning instead to the world of politics, where he soon discovered and became fascinated by Hitler and the Nazis. By 1930, he was the party's propaganda chief, coordinating and conducting a series of election campaigns which led ultimately to Hitler's rise to chancellor. In 1933, Goebbels was appointed head of the newly formed Reich Ministry of Information and Propaganda. Hampered by an unimpressive physical presence and a club foot, Goebbels is nevertheless a brilliant speaker and tireless salesman for the policies of the Reich. A masterful liar, Goebbels is a victim of his own propaganda. He idolizes Adolf Hitler and is the man responsible for bestowing on him the title of Führer and for instituting the now compulsory greeting of Heil Hitler. While Goebbels may be Hitler's most fervent supporter, it is Hermann Goering who is his most trusted subordinate. Recalling their early years together, Hitler said of Goering that he was ice cold in time of crisis. It is perhaps for this reason that Hitler has designated him as his successor. After serving in the military during World War I, Goering joined the Nazis in 1921 and was appointed Hitler's bodyguard. Shot in the groin during the beer hall putsch of 1923, he became addicted to morphine as a result of the painful wound, and has remained so on and off through the years. After Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933, Goering became president of Prussia, where he established two institutions which were to become mainstays of the regime. He opened the first concentration camps, used at the time to detain opponents of the party, and established the state secret police, which soon became known by its acronym, Gestapo. Despite his addiction and the resulting decline in mental stability, Goering has played a major role in many of the Nazis' greatest triumphs. In addition to his responsibilities in Prussia, in 1933, Goering was appointed Minister of Aviation and, in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, began a massive buildup of German air power. By 1939, Goering's Luftwaffe was the most powerful air force in the world and became the foundation on which Blitzkrieg was built. In 1940, when Polish leaders in Warsaw rejected demands for surrender, Goering bombed them into submission. Similar attacks led to the victories in Norway and France. It was these triumphs which compelled Hitler to create and appoint Goering to the position of Reichsführer, officially making the corpulent morphine addict the number 2 man in the Nazi party. Despite his power within the walls of the Chancellery, Goering is not considered by the citizens of Germany to be the most powerful man in the country. That distinction goes to the bespectacled former chicken farmer whose gift for terror and penchant for persecution propelled him to the upper echelons of the party and made him the most feared man in the Reich, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler's base of power is the Schutzstaffel, commonly known as the SS. He has, through deceit, murder, betrayal, and brute force, transformed what was a minor police force into the most powerful and efficient terrorist organization the world has ever known. By way of the SS, Himmler controls the Gestapo, which he commandeered from Goering in 1936, the Waffen-SS, an independent military force intended to challenge the authority of the Wehrmacht, and the entire system of Nazi concentration camps, the vehicle by which he intends to implement the final solution. There are others, past and present, who have contributed to the Nazis' eminence. The names of Bormann, Ribbentrop, Speer, and Hess will all find a place in the annals of history as men who helped lift Hitler to his zenith. But it is these three, Goebbels, Goering, and Himmler, who through lies, brutality, and terror have translated the twisted dictator's vision into a horrifying reality. Working alone, Adolf Hitler could never have hoped to fulfill his dreams of conquest. Yet he now stands as master of a continent, propelled by his own madness and by the efforts of a failed author, a morphine addict, and a chicken farmer. 3 June 1942, the Central Pacific. A lone Catalina reconnaissance plane flies through scattered cloud cover in search of the massive Japanese naval task force en route to Midway Island. Vastly outnumbered, it is essential that the American fleet find and attack the Japanese before Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo knows they are there. After hours of flying, the pilot spots the fleet some 700 miles west of Midway and reports its position. Immediately, Army Air Corps B-17 scramble from Midway to strike the approaching fleet. Dropping their bombs from 20,000 feet, the B-17s do not score any hits, but they do prompt Nagumo to move his attack schedule up by 1 day. On the morning of 4 June, from a position 240 miles northwest of Midway, Nagumo launches approximately half of his attack aircraft, armed with high explosive bombs, against the atoll. He retains the other half of his planes armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes to deal with any American ships that may be in the area. At the same time, Nagumo orders 7 search planes to reconnoiter a 300-mile radius around his carriers. With visions of repeating their glorious victory at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attackers approach Midway. This time, however, they are spotted, and the defensive forces on Midway are alerted. The Americans launch their bombers and fighters before the Japanese have a chance to destroy them on the ground. The bombers begin to search for Nagumo's carriers, and the fighters look to intercept the incoming Japanese planes. The Japanese quickly realize this is no Pearl Harbor. They have to fight their way to their target. The American aircraft manage to down several of the attackers before they reach the island. Over their target, they are greeted by fierce anti-aircraft fire. Although the attack does extensive damage, it comes far from achieving its intended goal of rendering Midway useless as an airbase. Meanwhile, the American bombers launched from Midway locate Nagumo's carriers. Once again, their bombing runs are ineffective, but they do keep the Japanese off balance. As the attack continues, Nagumo learns from the squadrons returning from Midway that a second strike will be necessary. He orders his remaining planes to be refitted with high explosive bombs more suitable to land attack. While the planes are being refitted with their new payload, Nagumo receives a disturbing report. One of the search planes has spotted an American surface fleet barely 200 miles north. Nagumo orders his remaining planes again to be refitted with anti-ship ordnance. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher's task force, centered around the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, has finally closed to within striking distance of Nagumo. At 150 miles, he is at the outer limits of his aircraft's range. Fletcher and his second-in-command, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, decide that hitting the Japanese first is critical and launch their attack. The planes head for Nagumo's last reported position, desperately hoping to catch the Imperial Navy completely unawares. In the meantime, the returning Japanese strike force has reached its carriers. Nagumo decides to retrieve the returning planes before launching a strike against the American task force. With this decision, he seals the fate of his carriers. At 9:40 a.m., Devastator torpedo bombers from the Hornet are the first to spot the Japanese flat tops. Before they can attack the ships, 50 Japanese Zeros flying combat air patrol attack them. Within minutes, all 15 of the Devastators are shot down. torpedo bombers from the Enterprise and 12 from the Yorktown are next to take up the attack. Again, the Zeros pounce. All but 6 of the bombers are quickly splashed into the sea, and no Japanese ships have yet been hit. Nagumo, ready to launch his strike on the Americans, has his flight decks covered with fully armed aircraft. As they are about to take off, 33 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise appear overhead. The Zeros, who have been busy eliminating the torpedo bombers, are at too low an altitude to intercept the dive bombers, and they get a free shot at the massive Japanese flat tops. Within minutes, 3 of the Japanese carriers, the Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, are reduced to infernos of exploding bombs, aircraft, and fuel. As the jubilant pilots turn for home, the surviving Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, launches 46 torpedo and dive bombers and a dozen escort fighters to strike back at the American carriers. Following returning American planes back to the Yorktown, the Japanese attack. The Yorktown is still suffering damage from the Battle of Coral Sea. The Japanese hit her with 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. Despite a heroic effort, the Yorktown's crew cannot save her and are forced to abandon ship. Late in the afternoon of the 4th, the Americans find the Hiryu and deal her a critical blow. The next day, damaged beyond repair, she is sunk by Japanese destroyers. For the Americans, it is an astounding victory. Midway is still in American hands, and the Japanese have been dealt a decisive blow. 4 of their best carriers now rest on the bottom of the Pacific, along with hundreds of their highly trained air crews. These are losses that will take Japanese industry and training programs years to replace. And although the Americans have lost the Yorktown, the balance of power in the Pacific has been drastically changed. The Imperial Navy is now irretrievably on the defensive. Japanese hopes for further expansion in the Pacific have been lost forever. 21 June 1942, Washington. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, having arrived in the capital after a brief but pleasant visit to the President's estate in Hyde Park, New York, begin informal discussions regarding the nature of Allied operations for the remainder of 1942 and 1943. Unlike the Arcadia Conference earlier in the year, these talks are at the same time less formal and more acrimonious. At that meeting, Churchill and his staff had been quite successful in persuading the President and American military leaders to accept their views on what the initial Allied approach to the war ought to be. But since the conference, the Washington contingent have begun to show signs of independent thought and action that the British, particularly Churchill, find disturbing. Not long after Arcadia, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff began to feel as though they had been railroaded by an English delegation who, having been at war for some time, were better prepared to state their case. The conferees had agreed to focus the bulk of Allied military might on defeating the Germans before dealing with the Japanese in the Pacific. However, continuing advances by the Emperor's armed forces have made it clear that to ignore the Japanese would be a mistake. As a result, there has been an increase in the flow of U.S. men and materiel to the Pacific theater rather than England. In addition, Roosevelt has begun to make decisions independent of his British counterpart. Following the signing of the Anglo-Soviet treaty last month, Soviet Foreign Secretary Vyacheslav Molotov visited the President and described to him the tremendous number of casualties and profound misery being suffered by Russian soldiers and citizens as a result of their efforts to beat back the Nazis. Sympathetic to their plight, Roosevelt, without consulting Churchill, pledged to alleviate the pressure by mounting a cross-channel invasion and opening a second European front before the end of 1942. No, there is no way he can in good conscience object to America's escalating defense of the Pacific. Churchill is determined to persuade FDR to delay the opening of a second front on the continent. Churchill argues that the proposed landing of between 6 and 8 divisions at an as-yet undetermined location on the coast of France in less than 6 months' time will be a bloodbath. Rather than France, he contends, the United States should execute an assault on the coast of North Africa, coming to the aid of British forces battling there. The Americans are not happy with the Prime Minister's position. The President is reluctant to renege on his commitment to Stalin. The Joint Chiefs are quick to point out that while Churchill, it seems, is unwilling to spill British blood in an operation to aid the Russians, he shows no compunction when asking Americans to lay down their lives in support of the English army. Churchill is, however, able to convince Roosevelt that Rommel's recent advances in North Africa are a threat to oil shipments coming through the Suez Canal, and in response, the President agrees to divert shipments of tanks and other supplies to the beleaguered British there. As the meeting concludes, Churchill feels satisfied despite the tempest. He knows that even though he was unable to convince the Americans to abandon their plan for a European invasion in 1942, he has certainly thrown a wrench into the gears. In addition, he has managed to redirect some shipments of supplies to his armies in Africa. There is another result of this meeting which is pleasing to Churchill. Early on in the visit, while he and FDR were at Hyde Park, they had discussed an ongoing U.S.-British project intended to develop a bomb using uranium, a weapon which would harness the power of the atom. The two agree that all of the project workings will be moved to American soil, but that any results will be shared by both countries. The result is that the Americans will do all of the work, bear all of the cost of the development process, and in the end, share the results with Great Britain. For the crafty statesman, it is a most pleasing arrangement. 11 June 1942, North Africa. On the stinging sands of the desert, the British and Nazi armies are squaring off for what may be the final battle to determine the continent's future. General Erwin Rommel, the German tank genius, believes that that battle will come at the Egyptian city of El Alamein, that it will come soon, and that his army, perhaps the best trained in the world, will win. That thought terrifies English Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who knows well that if the English toehold in North Africa is lost, it will be almost impossible to regain. The German Afrika Korps fights its way into the town of Bir Hakeim. The battle is fierce but short. The Germans take little time celebrating their victory before looking forward to their next target, Tobruk, the last significant obstacle between Rommel and El Alamein. Hard by the Mediterranean, Tobruk is an English stronghold no longer so strong. The Gazala line, a defensive buffer to the town's west, has been stripped of much of its firepower. Infantry and armament have been moved back to reinforce the defenses around El Alamein. The English are instead counting on tanks to blunt the German offensive. The British have more than 900 tanks on the outskirts of Tobruk and have shipped in as well 35,000 infantry reinforcements. Tanks are, of course, Rommel's specialty. And upon arriving at Bir Hakeim, the Desert Fox sets up a replay of what has been his strategy all across Africa. He places huge artillery batteries at strategic locations and then maneuvers his tanks to draw the English into range. As they have before, the English blunder into the German trap and find themselves cut literally to pieces by the German 88mm guns. Of the 900 tanks British General Sir Claude Auchinleck takes into battle on the 11th, only 65 come out on the 13th. Not surprisingly, Auchinleck believes that Tobruk cannot be held and suggests a withdrawal before the Germans can regather their strength. Churchill rejects the proposal, insisting that Tobruk be held. The Prime Minister orders Auchinleck to do so. At dawn on 20 June, Rommel launches what he believes will be the final assault on the city. More than 150 aircraft pummel the town center and the harbor from above, while German and Italian artillery around the city's edges lob thousands of rounds at the English positions. An infantry assault clears a path through an enormous minefield, and by noon, German tanks are freely wandering the streets of the city. What English commanders had hoped would be an orderly evacuation of Tobruk degenerates into chaos. The English headquarters moves from place to place, only steps ahead of the advancing Germans. The convoys setting out for El Alamein become shooting galleries for German tanks, which fire point blank into trucks loaded with infantry. By sunset, the battle for Tobruk is nearly over. General Klopper, the South African general in charge of British forces in the city, gets word out to his headquarters in El Alamein. If you are counterattacking, his message says, please let me know. There will be, however, no counterattack. The English forces dug in around El Alamein will stay dug in, awaiting Rommel's next inevitable advance. At 9 o'clock on the morning of 21 June, Klopper runs up the white flag of surrender. As the remaining English troops fall into German hands, it is clear that they have won the respect of their enemies. Rommel, a professional soldier through and through, tells his captives, "You have fought like lions and have been led by donkeys." Rommel's victory is so decisive that the day after the battle's end, Adolf Hitler promotes him, giving him the highest rank in the German army, Field Marshal. By that time, Rommel is already looking east to El Alamein, and what he is confident will be the ultimate German victory in Africa. To those who know him, it seems appropriate that New Year's Eve, 1941, marks the date of Admiral Chester Nimitz's assumption of the command of the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. The new year is customarily viewed as a time for personal change, but Nimitz's appointment may lead to a period of extraordinary change for the Navy. Despite his 56 years, he is a youthful, vigorous man with a passion for new ideas and bold concepts for the future direction of naval warfare in the Pacific theater. As interested as Nimitz is in guiding the Navy according to his new vision, his opinions are rooted in a reverence for naval history and on his own decades of military experience. Born and raised in Texas, Nimitz had never seen an ocean when he set out for his first year at the Naval Academy. As he would in all new experiences, he excelled, graduating 7th out of a class of 114. Following graduation, he was among an elite group of young sailors who were chosen to join the Navy's new experimental submarine force. By embracing the submarine, he began to distinguish himself as a man with a keen mind for recognizing the possibilities of new technologies and for developing tactics which best exploit their strengths. By the end of the First World War, Nimitz was a commander and one of the foremost submariners in the Navy. But he realized that in order to continue advancing his career, he would have to transfer to the regular service fleet. His experience as captain of several ships over the following years was particularly timely, as he was afforded the opportunity to witness the early development and growing pains of the aircraft carrier. Despite his distinguished career and boundless energy, it nonetheless came as a surprise when on 13 December 1941, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox told Nimitz that he was to take command of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz was told that one of the reasons for his promotion was the Navy's desire to send someone to Pearl who could ease the fear and shame of the survivors of the attack. Upon his arrival, he gathers the men together and tells them simply that they were not to blame for what happened, that he has complete faith in their abilities, and that he wants very much for all of them to remain under his command. Morale improves immediately. Seeing the aftermath of the attack firsthand, Nimitz states that in his estimation, the Japanese blow has not been so devastating after all. Pearl Harbor remains a viable naval facility. The machine shop, the submarine base, and millions of barrels of oil were untouched in the attack. As a result, the Navy does not have to retreat to California. Realizing that lack of information is the principal reason for the success of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he insists that he receive all intelligence information raw as it comes in, knowing every second that passes is one in which he could already be countering Japan's plans. As Nimitz sees it, the most effective way to renew the strength of the fleet is through use of the aircraft carrier. While he regrets the tragedy of December 7th, he is nonetheless relieved that the ships sunk were battleships, not carriers. The attack, for Nimitz, points plainly ahead towards a day when the battleship, long the center of naval warfare, gives way to the newer, smaller, quicker, and ultimately more powerful carrier. And while many in the Navy argue that our reliance on the battleship has brought us peace in the past, Nimitz maintains his faith that it is the carrier that will bring us peace in the future. August 1942, the Soviet Union, after surviving one of the worst winters in Russian history, coupled with a fierce Red Army counteroffensive, the Wehrmacht is once again on the move as the German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich von Paulus, pushes past the Don River, splitting Soviet defensive lines in the area, driving toward the city of Ranok, just north of Stalingrad on the Volga River. As winter drew to a close and both sides prepared to return to battle, Stalin was certain that Hitler would order a renewed attack on Moscow. Prior to being halted by the weather, the Germans had driven to the doorstep of the Soviet capital before being pushed back by the surprisingly potent counteroffensive. Believing that they would pick up where they left off, the Russians concentrated their forces near Moscow. In addition, Stalin, determined to continue driving the enemy back, resolved to attack south toward the Crimea and liberate Sevastopol, which had been under siege for months. In both cases, Stalin's reasoning proved to be flawed. Having underestimated the strength of the Germans in the region, the Soviet offensive was a complete failure, and Sevastopol fell to the Nazis on 4 July. A second offensive in the southwest yielded an even worse result when the Red Army stumbled into a German trap and 100,000 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner. As for Moscow, Hitler was content to leave things as they were while he focused instead on an offensive in the south. On 28 June, Army Group A began driving out of the Ukraine and toward the Caucasus, while just to the north, Army Group B, spearheaded by the panzers of von Paulus's Sixth Army, started advancing rapidly toward Stalingrad. With the ground baked hard by the summer sun, July and August found the armored divisions of the 6th driving hard and fast toward the Don. Now, having broken through, they arrive at Ranok, a mere 35 miles from their objective. As Stalingrad's defenders struggle to prepare for the impending ground assault, the Luftwaffe fills the sky over the city. Hundreds of Ju-88 bombers and Stukas fly some 4,000 sorties on the 23rd and 24th, turning Stalingrad into a sea of flames stretching 25 miles along the banks of the Volga. Despite the devastation raining down from above, the citizens of Stalingrad continue to prepare for its defense. Trenches are dug, fortifications built. Factory workers churn out tanks and guns 24 hours a day. Thousands of teenagers, officially too young to serve in the military, are put in uniform and given weapons. When there are no more rifles to be issued, soldiers are armed with metal pipes. Medical units are disbanded and their members pressed into battle. The wounded will be left where they fall while others carry on. And so it seems that, as it was at Moscow nearly a year ago, the Germans stand on the brink of capturing a Soviet city so crucial it might be considered the linchpin of the nation. Should Stalingrad fall, as Hitler has been proclaiming it will, it can be only a matter of time before Russia joins the list of countries conquered by the Reich. 3 August 1942, Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrives in Cairo to assess the situation facing the British Eighth Army in North Africa. Unimpressed by the performance of his commander in the region, General Claude Auchinleck, Churchill has decided to replace him. For months, the Eighth Army has, in Churchill's view, made little use of the tremendous amount of war materiel it has been allotted to drive the Germans out of North Africa. The fall of Tobruk was, for the already disgusted Prime Minister, the straw that broke the camel's back. Churchill, after conferring with General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, appoints General Sir Harold Alexander as head of the Near East Command. Churchill then decides to place Lieutenant General WWII Gott in charge of the Eighth Army. He is, however, forced to change his plans the next day as General Gott's plane is shot down en route to Cairo. His next choice for command is Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery. Alexander has reservations about Montgomery, particularly his penchant for taking credit for others' accomplishments. Despite these misgivings, Alexander knows Montgomery is an excellent battlefield commander and highly regarded by the troops. On 11 August, Churchill travels to Moscow to meet with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. The purpose of the visit is to apologize to Stalin. There will be no second European front in 1942. Churchill explains that an Allied assault against Hitler's fortress Europe would be doomed to failure until more men and materiel are available. As a consolation, he assures Stalin there will be a combined British and American offensive against Axis forces in North Africa in the fall. Having completed the delicate task of soothing the Russians, Churchill on 19 August returns to Cairo to meet with his newly appointed commanders. He tells Alexander that his one and only goal is to destroy the German forces in North Africa, and that all his efforts should be focused on doing so. Alexander assures the Prime Minister that he understands and that he will tenaciously pursue that goal. Churchill then travels to Montgomery's headquarters at Berg El Arab. The Prime Minister listens to Monty's plans for an offensive against Rommel in October. He presses the general, saying that October is too late, the offensive must begin sooner. Monty replies that if the offensive is to be launched before October, the PM will have to find someone else to lead it. Churchill yields. Monty then explains to the Prime Minister his plan for the defense of El Alamein, where he believes Rommel will strike next. At the center of his defense will be the 22nd Brigade, which is dug in at the base of Alam Halfa Ridge. He has instructed his commanders to hold here at all costs and not, under any circumstances, to be drawn into the open against Rommel's armor. For Churchill, the trip has been satisfying. Even if the timetable isn't exactly to his liking, his commanders have a specific plan for defeating Rommel and have taken concrete steps toward achieving that goal. But for Churchill, the biggest evidence of change in the situation is not on any map, but on the faces of the men of the Eighth Army. There is a cocky assuredness back in their step and a gleam in their eye that heartens the Prime Minister. Now he is certain he has all the right pieces in place to deliver the Germans a crushing blow in North Africa. August 1942, the Mediterranean. An Allied convoy steams toward the island of Malta, located 60 miles south of Sicily. 14 cargo vessels escorted by destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers are determined to deliver crucial aircraft and supplies to the beleaguered garrison on the island. Using it for its airfields and as a base for warships, The British have been devastatingly effective in destroying German shipping bound for its armies in North Africa. In August of 1941, no less than 35% of the men and supplies destined for Libyan ports were sent to the bottom by the British bastion on Malta. In December 1941, submarines from the Atlantic were moved to the Mediterranean, and Lieutenant General Hans Geisler's Luftwaffe forces began to pound the island incessantly. The siege of Malta had begun. Initially, the Germans enjoyed astounding success, sinking tons of British shipping, including the fleet aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious. Outdated British planes were hopelessly outgunned by Geisler's mighty Me-109s. In January, with the Luftwaffe riding roughshod over the British, all of the German shipments earmarked for Rommel's forces in North Africa reached the port at Tripoli unscathed. In the first week of March, just as the situation was growing critical, the British received a desperately needed shipment of new Spitfires, courtesy of the USS Wasp. With fighters able to contest the Messerschmitts, the British once again began to take a heavy toll on German shipping. The Luftwaffe, too, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, then stepped up its campaign to eliminate Malta as an obstacle to German control of the Mediterranean. With as many as 300 bombers hitting the island at a time, the defenders were reduced to receiving ammunition and supplies from submarines, slipping into the port at night. Now the Allies have sent this massive convoy to relieve the defenders. As determined as they are to reach Malta, the Germans are just as determined to stop them. The first to strike the convoy are the German subs. The carrier, HMS Eagle, is struck by 4 torpedoes and goes to the bottom with 200 of her crew. The Luftwaffe then begins an all-out assault on the fleet. For 3 days, carrier-based planes and anti-aircraft crews fight off German torpedo and dive bombers, but suffer heavy losses. On the 14th, however, 4 of the cargo ships reach Malta with their vital supplies. While Malta itself may seem insignificant, it is pivotal to the war in North Africa. The pendulum in the desert has consistently swung in favor of the side controlling the shipping lanes of the Mediterranean. Now, with the British garrison on Malta replenished and the 8th Army in North Africa under new leadership, British commanders hope that the next swing of the pendulum will be in their favor. From all appearances, this Second World War will likely be decided more in the air than any war in history. The Nazis have taught the world a devastating lesson, that air superiority is all superiority, and that while no battle is won until the ground is taken, it is not possible to take that ground without first taking the air. It is the fighters, allied and enemy, that will ultimately decide the issue of air superiority. They will accompany or turn back the bombers that will be the ground forces' torment. They will search and strafe and harass, inevitably becoming key players in the war of aerial attrition. As the war begins, America's primary fighter is the P-40 Warhawk, manufactured by Curtiss Aviation. With a top speed of 364 miles an hour, it is slower than the Focke-Wulf 109, Germany's best fighter. It is also less agile than the Japanese Zero, a distinct disadvantage in a dogfight. But among the pilots who fly the Warhawk, it has a reputation as a tough plane to kill. The pilot sits against an armored bulkhead behind a bulletproof windscreen. The wings are studded with 650 caliber machine guns that can be focused to converge along a killing line hundreds of yards long. What the Warhawk most lacks, what all Allied fighters lack at this juncture, is range. Even with the optional belly tank, the Warhawk in combat has a normal range of barely 600 miles, not enough to accompany bombers on their long-distance missions behind enemy lines. Even as production of Warhawks increases, however, the Air Corps is also bringing on a new generation of fighters that are faster, pack more punch, and hopefully are the equal of anything the enemy can field. Closest to deployment is Lockheed's P-38 Lightning. Designed in 1937 as a high-altitude interceptor, the P-38 captured the public imagination when it flew from California to New York in only 7 hours. The transcontinental record, while impressive, was overshadowed by the fact that the prototype crashed on arrival. A complete structural redesign followed. The plane that is emerging from that troubled development is impressive. It is lighter than the prototype, more agile, with more fuel capacity and armament. It carries 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon and has a top speed nearly equal to the Focke-Wulf. P-38s by the hundreds should be rolling off assembly lines by mid-1942. Not far behind is the P-47 Thunderbolt, a high-powered pug of a plane designed primarily for speed in battle. Conceived as a lightweight interceptor, it emerged from development as a heavy fighter capable of both escort and attack missions. Test pilots quickly named the P-47 the Jug. Its distinctive, blunt shape is the result of its huge air-cooled radial engine. While most fighters today use longer, more aerodynamic engines, the Thunderbolt's 18-cylinder monster pulls it along at 440 miles an hour. The first Thunderbolts rolled off the production lines as the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. By the end of 1942, they should be a familiar sight overseas. Finally, there is the P-51 Mustang. Designed to British specifications, Mustangs are currently being tested with limited success on both sides of the Atlantic. It is, at high speeds, underpowered and sluggish. The British, who have taken possession of the first production run of Mustangs, are tinkering with the plane, trying to save it. The United States, disillusioned with the plane, has redesignated it for low-level reconnaissance. Ultimately, the new planes will have to prove themselves in battle. Their opportunity for that will come very soon. If they are successful, it will say much about the ultimate outcome of this war. 31 August 1942, as Italian forces harassed British outposts outside the Egyptian city of El Alamein, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Corps swings south to attack the main British line of defense. The attack is not unexpected. The British have for weeks been fortifying their defenses around the city, believing that the battle to be fought there may determine the fate of all of North Africa. Like the British, Rommel believes that El Alamein will be pivotal. But unlike the British, he has been unable to resupply and reinforce his troops. Rommel, whose strategy is based on fast, coordinated attacks, has been forced to scrounge for fuel amid the destruction the Afrika Corps has wrought. As Rommel's tanks approach the dug-in British, they do so with the firm knowledge that their mobility is not unlimited, that this battle will have to be fought more frontally than any of their others. More important, they approach El Alamein without benefit of the element of surprise. The English have had weeks to dig in, and as the German tanks slice through the first light British defenses, they are set upon by the RAF. With fresh aircraft, pilots, and virtually unlimited fuel, the RAF quickly establishes air superiority. Tanks in the desert are easy targets for aircraft, and without the protective Luftwaffe, the Afrika Corps takes heavy casualties. Rommel, despite an instinctive urge to pull back and regroup, fights on toward the sea. Moving along the seemingly unoccupied Alam Halfa Ridge, he makes a telling discovery. Newly arrived British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery has dug the British tanks into the ridge like artillery, burying them to their turrets in protective sand. As the Nazis approach, The tanks ambush the slowly advancing Germans. The combined tank barrage and air assault makes progress nearly impossible. Rommel attempts to draw the British tanks out of their fortifications, a maneuver that has worked well for him in the past. But on Montgomery's orders, the Brits don't budge. On 1st September, Rommel again considers withdrawal and decides that punching through the British lines is worth one more try. Coordinating his attack with the weakened Luftwaffe, he makes one more assault on Alam Halfa Ridge, hoping desperately that the British, weakened by previous assaults, will decide to fall back. Monty's men, however, hold their ground. For the third time in 2 days, the Nazis are beaten back. As night falls, the British defenses are intact, the battlefield strewn with burning German tanks. On 2 September, as Rommel considers an end run around the entrenched British, he receives word that a German tanker carrying 8,000 tons of fuel has been sunk, crossing the Mediterranean. There will be no daring dash across the desert, no surprise attack at the British flank that will win the day. Rommel knows that he is not going to be able to take El Alamein and withdraws with what remains of his Panzer Corps. As he goes, the RAF continues its harassment, bombing the retreating Nazi column, turning the roadway into a kind of highway of death. It presents a tempting opportunity. A sudden charge by the British might well finish the Afrika Corps for good. The British armor, however, stays put. Montgomery's predecessors were victimized several times by German counterattacks, and Montgomery, who is as careful a commander as there is, decides that it is better to leave the potential knockout blow for another day. At El Alamein, he will be satisfied with a simple victory. July 1942, the South Pacific. After gathering just south of the Fiji Islands, an American naval task force under the command of Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher set sail for the Solomon Islands. The operation, dubbed Watchtower, marks the beginning of what promises to be a long and bloody struggle to drive the Japanese from their chain of Pacific Island bases. The stunning defeat of the Japanese fleet at Midway marked, for both sides, a decisive turning point in the course of the war. For the Japanese, it was a rude awakening. They were, for the first time, forced to swallow the bitter pill of defeat and accept the fact that further expansion to the south and west would no longer be possible. For the Americans, it was a desperately needed victory. It bolstered the spirit of the public and created a crack in the Japanese defenses, which the Allies are now attempting to exploit. The Solomons, located in the torrid latitudes just south of the equator, offer the Americans two vital bases: a deep-water seaport at the island of Tulagi and, perhaps more important, a partially completed airfield on the island of Guadalcanal. The importance of these facilities is not lost to either side. For the Japanese, they offer a forward base from which their naval and air forces can impede the flow of men and materiel pouring across the South Pacific to Australia. For the Allies, taking the port and airfield will not only help secure the supply routes, but will also provide a platform for launching far-reaching offensive operations against the Japanese. Under cover of heavy weather, Fletcher's task force is able to approach their objective undetected by the Japanese. The men of the 1st Marine Division, under the command of Major General Alexander Vandergrift, prepare for what will be the first true test of American land forces in this war. In the pre-dawn hours of 7 August, naval guns and carrier-based aircraft begin pounding Japanese positions on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. Australian coast watchers in the hills on Guadalcanal direct the fire, which is extremely effective. The Australians are amazed at the accuracy of the Navy's big guns, watching as one by one Japanese positions vanish in clouds of fire and flying debris. As As the Marines head for the beaches on both Tulagi and Guadalcanal, there is no response from the Japanese on the islands. The men in the assault boats share a cautious optimism. Reaching the beach, it seems as if the bombardment has driven the Japanese off the island. The Marines land completely unopposed, and as they move inland to the partially completed airfield at Lunga Point, it's quite clear that the Japanese pulled out in a hurry. Equipment, ammunition, and rations are abandoned everywhere. While Marines secure the airfield, logistical problems are mounting on the beach. Material is coming off ships faster than it can be moved to inland cover. American commanders, fearing that an attack by Japanese bombers could easily destroy the vital supplies, slow the flow of material coming in. This gives the men on the island time to move the existing supplies inland, but reduces the total amount of supplies available. By late in the afternoon of 7 August, the Marines on Tulagi make contact with the Japanese. An enemy garrison holed up in the caves on the eastern end of the tiny island begins showering the Marines with heavy machine gun fire. Marines are stunned by the Japanese unwillingness to surrender in the face of such an overwhelming force. They are forced to destroy the Japanese positions one by one. Of the 2,000 defenders on the island, 23 are taken prisoner. Meanwhile, on Guadalcanal, the unloading of supplies has been interrupted by a flight of twin-engined Japanese bombers. Anti-aircraft batteries and Navy fighters quickly downed 7 of the attackers and forced the rest to flee. But the attacks continue off and on through the afternoon of the 8th. While they do little damage, they cause serious delays in the unloading of equipment and supplies. By late afternoon on the 8th, Admiral Fletcher believes he can no longer keep his ships anchored off Guadalcanal. He is certain that the Japanese fleet must be steaming toward him. Fuel reserves for his fighters are dangerously low, threatening to leave the critical flat tops defenseless. He orders the carriers to steam out of the area, leaving the amphibious force without air cover. Without the protection of the Fleet Air Wing, Admiral Richmond Turner informs Vandegrift that he will have to withdraw his cruisers and transports to prevent losing them to the Japanese bombers. Vandegrift is furious. If the amphibious support ships leave, his Marines will be stranded on these jungle islands with only a portion of their supplies. Near midnight, as the two commanders feud, a Japanese naval force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer slips past American pickets near Savo Island, 10 miles off the coast of Guadalcanal. Catching Turner's force completely off guard, the Japanese hit the Allies with torpedoes and gunfire. In a matter of moments, an Australian and 3 American cruisers are turned into burning masses of twisted steel and begin sinking to the bottom. The Japanese commander, elated with his success but fearful that Fletcher's carriers would be launching a retaliatory airstrike, decides to retire to Rabaul. By doing that, the Japanese miss their chance to sink the transport and supply ships sitting defenseless off the coast of Guadalcanal. After this humiliating defeat, Turner orders what is left of his force to leave the area. He takes with him tons of supplies, rations, barbed wire, field artillery pieces, and the equipment the Marines need to complete the airfield. 1,000 Marine reserves are also on the ships as they turn and sail off. The 6,000 Marines on Tulagi and the 10,000 on Guadalcanal are left completely isolated. All they can do now is prepare for an attack that they know will come. The men dig their defensive positions, working feverishly to complete the airfield with the little equipment at their disposal. They know the airfield is the key. Air cover will be critical if they are to survive until they can be resupplied and reinforced. As the Marines prepare for the fight to come, Allied military commanders hold their breath. Success on Guadalcanal, they know, would only be the first step in the long trek across the Pacific. But failure would be a devastating blow to the Allied cause. If the Japanese can stop the flow of men and materiel to Australia, the war in the Pacific may be lost. 24 August 1942, Stalingrad. As the sun rises, a pall of smoke hangs over the city, and along with it, the threat of German conquest. Having been attacked almost non-stop for the last 24 hours by a seemingly endless stream of Luftwaffe bombers and fighter bombers, Stalingrad is a sea of flames, and the rising sun brings no respite as German bombs continue to fall. These air raids are the prologue of a planned ground assault which Nazi commanders fully expect will drive the Red Army from this military and psychological stronghold on the Volga River. Just north of the city, Army Group B, under the command of General Friedrich von Paulus, stands poised, having halted briefly to allow the Luftwaffe to soften up the Russian defenses. But with Hitler having decreed that Stalingrad must fall by the 25th, there is little time to waste. With the bombs still falling on the city center, German armor begins its push toward the northern suburb of Rennach. As they advance, the Panzers find themselves engaging divisions which exist primarily on paper and in the wishful thoughts of Stalin and his commanders. They are, by and large, newly recruited, poorly trained, and ill-equipped. Nazi tanks make quick work of the outer defensive lines. By 25 August, the day Hitler had expected to announce the fall of Stalingrad, the Red Army is able to regroup and counterattack, driving the Wehrmacht troops back nearly to the shores of the Volga. The victory is short-lived, however, and by 1st September, the Nazis have not only turned back the counteroffensive, they have pushed deep into Stalingrad. The beginning of the month finds the fate of Stalingrad resting squarely on the shoulders of the newly appointed Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Georgy Zhukov. Having been elevated to his new position on 27 August, he is now second only to Stalin himself in the chain of command, and the Russian leader has made it clear to Zhukov that his immediate task is to keep Stalin's namesake city from falling to the Nazis. On 3 September, Zhukov orders an attack against German supply routes north of the city near the Volga. Intended to stem the flow of Nazi troops and equipment across the river, the offensive grinds to a halt when Red Army troops run out of ammunition. Under direct orders from Stalin, Zhukov again takes up the battle on 5 September. The Russians fight ferociously, but the Germans are too well entrenched. By the 10th, Zhukov reports to Stalin that the effort has been for naught and that Stalingrad may be lost. But even as the message reaches Moscow, the German advance into Stalingrad has begun to slow, and it is the city itself, rather than its defenders, that is impeding the Nazi troops. Aggressive bombing by the Luftwaffe, along with the fierce combat, have filled the streets with rubble, making passage by panzers difficult at best. As a result, most of the fighting must be done by infantry, moving slowly from street to street. The further they progress, the harder they are forced to fight for every foot they take. On 12 September, command of the Russian 62nd Army is taken over by a tough, lean general by the name of Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov, and almost immediately the Germans' task becomes even more difficult. Declaring to Stalin and to his men, "We shall either hold the city or die there," Chuikov turns his army into a band of urban guerrillas, urging them to conceal themselves in basements and bombed-out buildings. He makes it clear that retreat is not an option, and cowardice will be punished by death. It is not long before his men begin to refer to him as General Stubbornness. Still, despite the slowdown, the German advance continues. By 16 September, the Russians hold only a sliver of the city and are down to their final cohesive line of defense, which is anchored by a huge grain elevator. From their positions in the elevator, the Red Army troops are able to pin down an entire Wehrmacht battalion and stall the German advance for 6 days. Yet, in spite of the heroic efforts of Chuikov's men, by 22 September, the defensive line crumbles. As it does, the men of the 62nd fall back into the smoke and rubble of the city, assembling into small groups, concealing themselves in the ruins of Stalingrad, preparing to hold out at all costs. And so it is that nearly a month after Adolf Hitler had declared that Stalingrad would become his latest conquest, the Wehrmacht seemingly stands poised to deliver the prize to their leader. August 1942, the English Channel. An armada of 253 ships set sail for the coast of France. This marks the beginning of Operation Jubilee, a commando raid on the German-held port of Dieppe. Comprised primarily of Canadian troops, the operation has several goals. First, to help appease Russian dictator Joseph Stalin, who is demanding a second European front. Second, to satisfy the Canadians who have been itching to get into the fight. And third, to destroy vital dock facilities as well as food, ammunition, and fuel stores. The hastily planned operation runs into trouble early. German trawlers spot the force and send up signal flares alerting the defenders of Dieppe. German E-boats attack the landing craft as they make their way to shore, killing many of the men before they ever set foot on land. Upon reaching the beach, things continue to get worse. The landing area is surrounded by a high bluff, concealing German artillery and machine gun positions. It is for the Germans a virtual shooting gallery. The Canadians try desperately to drive inland, advancing into a hail of machine gun and mortar fire. The landscape is covered with dead and wounded men and smashed equipment. After 9 hours of desperate fighting, it is apparent to both sides that Operation Jubilee is an unmitigated disaster. The order is given for the men to retreat to the ships. For many, however, it is too late. Over 1,000 men are dead, and 2,500 are taken prisoner. Operation Jubilee is a hard lesson learned. Any future assault against German coastal defenses must be preceded by massive naval and aerial bombardment, and more important, must be one of overwhelming force. For now, all the Allies can do is retreat to Britain to lick their wounds and wait for another chance at cracking Fortress Europe. They are peas in a pod. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. Twin dictators who rode the same tide of European discontent to total control of their respective nations, they now threaten both their own people and the outside world in a way that is almost unparalleled in history. Hitler, of course, is well known. But Italian Premier Mussolini, very much the junior partner in the European Axis, is less familiar. In many ways, however, it was Mussolini who paved the way for Hitler, who showed the Nazi tyrant the path from obscurity to power. Mussolini, like Hitler, was a veteran of World War I who returned to a nation descending into chaos. Unlike the Germans, the Italians were not a defeated nation. But throughout Europe, historic tides were building. The Great Depression, which didn't strike the United States until the 1930s, crippled Europe in the early 1920s. The elite running the continent showed little concern for the plight of the unemployed and starving. From the East, Marxism and its descendant communism promised the increasingly disgruntled masses a kind of paradise where employment was total and want was nothing to fear. Mussolini watched the onset of anarchy as a newspaper writer and editor. Gaining a reputation as a firebrand and enemy of the established order, he was chased out of Austria for his rabble-rousing, and upon landing in his native Italy, quickly thrust himself into the emerging movement of veterans disgruntled with the status quo. In 1919, he created the Fascist Party, ran unsuccessfully for Parliament later that year, and, like Hitler, was implicated in a plot to overthrow his country's government. Unlike Hitler, who served jail time for his treason, Mussolini was spared incarceration. The fascists continued to organize and agitate, and in only 3 years, Mussolini went from disgrace to the Italian premier's office. Christened by his followers Il Duce, the leader, he watched with great interest as Hitler seized control of Germany in 1933. One of the Führer's first acts was to arrange a meeting with Il Duce. The two dictators met in Venice in June 1934 and took an almost instant dislike to each other. Hitler was ill at ease in the unfamiliar role of head of state and interpreted Mussolini's preoccupation with grand ceremonial flourishes as a snub. In 1935, spurring the Italian people on with reminders of Rome's lost empire, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. His legions, armed with machine guns and artillery, easily defeated the Ethiopians, fighting largely with weapons that would have been familiar to Julius Caesar. Despite their initial differences, the dictators' mutual interests drew Hitler and Mussolini together. In 1936, they cooperated to provide arms and advisors to aspiring Spanish dictator Francisco Franco. The relationship between the dictators cemented in 1937. Mussolini visited Hitler in Berlin, and for 5 days they romped around Nazi Germany, observing combat maneuvers and parades of goose-stepping soldiers. Hitler took Austria a year later, and Mussolini, virtually alone among European leaders, did not complain. He acquiesced to Hitler's absorption of Czechoslovakia, protested only mildly when the Germans invaded Poland, and when the Nazis invaded France, Mussolini's only reaction was to join in the plunder. They are peas in a pod, Hitler and Mussolini. Twin dictators challenging the world to come stop them. They are only now receiving the world's answer. 12 August 1942, Guadalcanal. In the 1 week since their abandonment, the Marines here have nearly completed their first task on the island, the construction of an airfield from which to launch assaults on other islands in the Solomon chain. The job has been complicated by a lack of adequate equipment, harshly limited rations, nightly shelling, and a continuing air war which is more of an annoyance than an actual threat. Henderson Field, named by the men in honor of a Marine flyer killed in the Battle of Midway, is not yet adequate for the large bombers required for a full-scale onslaught against the Japanese. Nonetheless, it can accommodate the handful of Marine fighter planes currently helping protect the ground forces from the Japanese aerial assault. While the American pilots are kept busy fighting off the Japanese, who have a seemingly inexhaustible supply of planes, the engineers on the ground face travails almost as great. The meteorological extremes endemic to the Solomons make keeping the field operational a constant battle. The runway often changes from an impenetrable dust cloud to a veritable swamp in the course of just 1 day. Most frustrating to the Marines on the ground is the endless waiting. The knowledge that the Japanese are out there planning, waiting for just the right moment to attack, leads to a miserable combination of persistent edginess and interminable boredom. The men are left only to walk guard daily and to work on their airfield. By 20 August, Henderson Field is prepared enough to receive its first new planes. A few dozen Dauntless dive bombers and Grumman Wildcats arrive, and the Navy pilots quickly integrate into the Cactus Air Force. The weary Marines welcome the new faces, knowing that the sooner the Japanese planes are held at bay, the sooner they can get on with their job on the ground and get off Guadalcanal. On 21 August, the waiting is over. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki and his men attack in an attempt to retake Henderson Field. Charging headlong into the American positions, the Japanese are cut to pieces by the Marines' well-coordinated machine gun and artillery fire. Although they never breached the defensive perimeter, over 800 Japanese die in a battle lasting only a few hours, leaving only a handful of survivors to retreat. Following the Japanese attack, life for the men on Henderson Field returns to the pattern of annoyance and boredom of the previous weeks. On the evening of 12 September, the 35th Japanese Brigade launches a three-pronged assault on the Marines on Lizard Hill, which overlooks Henderson Field from the north. If Lizard Hill changes hands, both the Japanese and the Americans know that the American hold on the airstrip is as good as lost. Though the Americans hold the line, as the Japanese withdraw, the men know that this was nothing more than a test. The real attack is yet to come, and the men spend the day fortifying their positions. The Japanese attack on 13 September. This time, they focus the bulk of their force on the center of the Marines' line on Lizard Hill. Although the Japanese units attack with bravery and determination, they are uncoordinated and are slaughtered by machine gun and artillery fire. The Marines succeed in holding their line, but at a cost. 59 Marines are dead, over 200 are wounded, and the survivors have begun calling the site of the gruesome battle Bloody Ridge. The victory brings no sense of relief. The Marines, as they have in the previous weeks, return to the business of life on Guadalcanal. They work on the airfield, tighten their defensive positions, and then, as always, wait. August 1942, North Africa. After the stunning British victory at the Battle of El Alamein, the English 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery and the Axis armies under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel have settled into defensive positions only a few thousand yards apart. Separating the two sides is a vast German minefield known as Devil's Garden. Containing more than 500,000 anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, the barrier gives Rommel's forces a temporary sense of security. Although they realize that an offensive by Montgomery is inevitable, the minefield presents him with a difficult obstacle. He will need time to marshal his forces in order to breach it. In the meantime, both forces endure the brutal summer of the North African desert. Although the sweltering heat and the millions of biting flies show no favor to either side, life for the Axis troops is decidedly more miserable than for their British counterparts. A severe lack of fresh water makes bathing a luxury the Axis troops cannot afford. Their own unpleasant aroma, coupled with the stench of the battlefield and human excrement, serve to rob the troops of their appetite. Living in filth, undernourished, and fighting the biting flies, the Axis troops begin to lose weight, becoming easy prey to disease. Even Rommel, the desert fox himself, succumbs. His personal physician, Dr. Horster, reports that the field marshal suffers low blood pressure and dizzy spells and recommends Rommel return to Germany for treatment. By 30 August, Rommel's condition becomes so severe that he reluctantly agrees to leave his Africa Corps to seek medical help. He meets with his officers, giving detailed instructions on what to do in almost any imaginable scenario. On 23 September, Rommel begins his trip home. After a stop in Italy to confer with Mussolini, Rommel continues on to a meeting with Hitler on the 30th. Hitler presents the field marshal with a jewel-encrusted baton and assures him that everything will be done to guarantee an Axis victory in North Africa. On 3 October, Rommel, under pressure from Goebbels, holds a press conference with international correspondents. He reads a prepared speech declaring that Axis troops 50 miles from Alexandria and Cairo, have the door to Egypt in their hands, and guarantees that after coming so far, they will not be denied their prize. Whether or not Rommel can live up to that promise may well be decided in his absence. British intelligence knows he is no longer in North Africa. The question now is, will Montgomery take this opportunity to attack while facing a lesser general, or will he wait until he has built his forces and risk confrontation with a rejuvenated desert fox? 12 September 1942, the South Atlantic. While patrolling some 250 miles northeast of Ascension Island, the captain of German U-boat 156 spots the silhouette of a ship which is quickly identified as the British ocean liner Laconia. The 20,000-ton Laconia, formerly an armed merchant cruiser but now operating as a troop transport, is deemed a legitimate target. In short order, U-156 fires a torpedo at the unsuspecting vessel. What the sub's captain and crew do not realize is that the ship is carrying Italian soldiers captured in North Africa to prisoner of war camps in Canada. Also among the passengers are British women and children. The Laconia is only one of a staggering number of casualties in the battle between the German U-boats and the Allied naval forces. The seas that link the factories of America to the battlefields of Europe and North Africa have become the scene of a deadly cat-and-mouse game, one in which the playing field seems to pitch and roll, much like the ocean itself, favoring one side and then the other. In the early part of the war, supplies carried from America to England often traveled in individual ships without escort. For the U-boats, these lone, unarmed travelers were fish in a barrel. But steadily, the British developed methods and practices that not only reduced the loss of their ships, but also began making a serious dent in Germany's underwater fleet. Freighters began to travel in groups. They were accompanied by vessels specifically designed to combat submarines. Escort aircraft with improved radar and other targeting devices joined with the ships to begin sinking more and more of the marauding U-boats. In the last 4 months of 1941, 66 German submarines were permanently submerged. Just as the North Atlantic was becoming safer for Allied merchantmen, the United States entered the war and opened a window of opportunity for the Nazi subs. Prior to the commencement of hostilities between Germany and the U.S., ships traveling in the coastal waters of America did so without fear of attack. Once war was declared, these ships became fair game for the wolf packs. Despite the presence of only 5 Nazi subs, the final 2 weeks of 1941 saw 46 Allied merchantmen sunk off the east coast of America. Allied losses in the region continued to climb. In June, 121 freighters were sent to the bottom. It was at this point that the U.S. decided, perhaps somewhat belatedly, to institute interlocking convoys between the St. Lawrence and the Caribbean. With the freighters now protected at every point of their journey, American and British commanders might have felt justified in expecting a reduction in shipping losses. Now, however, the Nazis have begun churning out submarines at a phenomenal rate. By the end of 1942, the number of operational U-boats will, in all likelihood, be double what it was in January. As quickly as they are produced, they are manned by crews and dispatched to wreak havoc among the Allied convoys. Most of these crews are inexperienced and, as a result, probably doomed. They will, however, not go quietly. And so the game continues, with each player upping the ante, increasing the stakes. But while the engineers and politicians in Washington and Berlin are the ones who deal the cards, it is the men, and in cases such as the Laconia, the women and children, gambling their lives on the seas, who will continue to pay the price. October 1942, Stalingrad. As a beleaguered Red Army, plagued by shortages of weapons, food, and ammunition, struggles to hang on to a small strip of their city, in Washington, officials of the U.S. and USSR are signing an agreement designed to alleviate those deficiencies and bolster the Soviet war effort. Over the next 9 months, American Lend-Lease convoys will deliver nearly 4.5 million tons of supplies to a Soviet military machine starved for equipment and raw materials. The relief can't come too soon as far as Joseph Stalin and his commanders are concerned. In sweeping across Russia, the Nazis have captured factories, foundries, iron and coal mines, and power plants. Soviet output of war material has been reduced by more than 60%. Since the inception of Lend-Lease, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt have diverted shipments intended for Britain to the Russian port of Murmansk in the Arctic Ocean. But these stopgap deliveries have not been enough to sustain the Soviets over the long haul. With the signing of the agreement, the shipping of supplies can begin in earnest. Tons of equipment are loaded at ports in the U.S. and Britain, and the captains and crews prepare for what will probably be the most treacherous voyage they have ever taken. While maritime shipping during wartime has always been hazardous, these supply ships face an added element of danger. The German Navy has stationed destroyers, cruisers, U-boats, and battleships off the northern coast of Norway, putting them almost directly in the path of the Russian-bound fleets. With the Arctic sun shining 24 hours a day, the Nazi ships have had a devastating impact on convoys bound for Murmansk. In one instance, 23 of 34 freighters bound for the Russian port were sent to the bottom by the Germans. This had so shocked Churchill that he ordered a halt to shipments, but Roosevelt, while acknowledging the dangers, insists that they be resumed. The value of the Russian front in diluting Germany's military might is too great to be ignored. All of this has little meaning to the Russian men and women battling in the streets of Stalingrad. They know only that each day brings more fighting, more destruction, more death. Each time they seem to be holding the line, the Wehrmacht mounts yet another offensive. On 14 October, German General Friedrich von Paulus orders an attack in the northern sectors of the city. For von Paulus and his 6th Army, Stalingrad has been no cakewalk. It seems that each crumbling building has been turned into a small Russian fortress, which must be wrenched from the clutches of a resolute Red Army. This offensive is no different. Directly in the path of the attack is a huge tractor factory, which has been occupied and fortified by the Russians. Von Paulus orders 2 Panzer and 2 infantry divisions to clear the factory. The fighting is bloody and intense. It takes 4 days of fighting before the last Soviet soldier is killed and the factory taken. So even as the battle continues and the Germans advance, von Paulus begins to suspect that he and his men may be moving into dire straits. His options are few, however. Pushed forward by a fanatical dictator with little taste for retreat and committed to the point where withdrawal is no longer an alternative, he must instead ask himself, having fought so hard to defeat so few, how he and his men can possibly overcome a whole army of Russians. 21 October 1942, the Atlantic. Steaming from Britain and the United States, an armada larger and more powerful than any in history begins converging off the coast of North Africa. Made up of over 600 ships and carrying over 100,000 men, this fleet is the backbone of an amphibious operation known as Torch, which is intended to begin the rollback of Nazi troops throughout the African continent. Just as important, it is the first large-scale deployment of American troops against Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. While the Germans are certainly the primary foe facing the U.S. troops, Allied commanders led by Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower aren't certain whether their first contact will be with the Nazis or with the forces of the Vichy French. Though Rommel's Africa Corps controls much of Libya and western Egypt, the whole of northwest Africa is under the control of the French. The Vichy regime, which chose to cooperate with Hitler after the Nazi conquest of France itself, is technically neutral in Africa. But it is a neutrality without credibility to everyone outside of Berlin or the city of Vichy. Marshal Pétain, the World War I hero who made peace with the German invaders and the head of the Vichy state, is considered by the Allies to be, quite simply, a collaborator. The British, in particular, have reason to be wary of the French. Winston Churchill ascended to the prime ministry on the heels of Neville Chamberlain, who made the mistake of believing Hitler. Despite promises from Pétain and Hitler that French ships would not be co-opted into the service of the Reich, the Royal Navy commandeered and impounded the French fleet. The few French vessels that refused to submit to British boarding were sunk. That action has spurred a great deal of bitterness, not only in the Vichy regime, but among the Free French living in exile in London. Charles de Gaulle, who is totally dependent on the British, denounces the move, and French patriots in exile the world over complain that the British are no better than the Nazis. Hoping that the French will be less likely to open fire on American soldiers than British soldiers, the invasion from top to bottom is almost entirely an American operation. Eisenhower's preparations have been as much diplomatic as military. It is his hope that the French military in North Africa can be converted to the Allied cause. To that end, on 21 October, as the ships begin assembling off the African coast, he dispatches Major General Mark Clark to Algeria to conduct secret meetings with the French general, Charles Masse. Reporting to Eisenhower in Gibraltar, Clark says that Masse seemed duly impressed by the size of the arriving American force and gave assurances that, provided he was given 4 days' notice, troops under his command would offer no meaningful resistance to the Allied invasion. In addition, he agrees to accept the appointment of General Henri Giraud as Commander-in-Chief of French forces in North Africa. Meanwhile, as Allied ships continue to gather in the Atlantic, the American soldiers who are scheduled to go ashore are preparing for war. They go through drills, briefings, and inspections. Inevitably, in quiet moments, the young men find themselves housed in the unfamiliar confines of a troopship, as far from home as most of them have ever been, alone with their thoughts. With the exception of a few old-timers who served in the First World War, they are as yet untested in battle. Soon enough, they know, that will change, as these ships carry them, and with them America, into battle with Hitler and the Nazis. 7 October 1942, Guadalcanal. Since repulsing the fierce Japanese attacks on Bloody Ridge in mid-September, life for the Marines here has fallen back into a daily routine of misery and boredom broken by moments of stark terror as Japanese bombers pound their positions. Stifling heat, torrential rain, and rampant disease make daily existence on the island nearly unbearable. The Marines are isolated and they know it. Sensing that the number of Japanese on the island is increasing, their morale plummets. After 2 months without relief, even the most gung-ho among them begin to doubt they will ever get off this steamy, malaria-ridden island. Increasingly, Henderson Field, the airfield that is both their reason for being on the island and their hope for salvation, has come under Japanese shelling. Without reliable air cover, the Marines are easy prey for the flights of Japanese bombers passing overhead. U.S. commanders decide that even though they are undermanned, an offensive is necessary to drive the enemy back from the Henderson Field perimeter. On 7 October, the 1st Marine Division attacks west out of the beachhead toward the mouth of the Matanuco River. For the Marines, even the horrendous fighting is a welcome change. After months of boredom and defensive warfare, they are finally taking the battle to the Japanese. In heavy fighting on the 8th and 9th, the Marines wipe out an entire Japanese battalion. With that taste of victory, the Marines are anxious to continue their attack, but incoming intelligence indicates that the Japanese are preparing an offensive of their own. Much to the Marines' dismay, they are withdrawn to their original defensive positions. Again, they wait. Meanwhile, bombers operating from Henderson Field begin to enjoy some success in destroying Japanese transports landing troops on the island. On 13 October, the Imperial Navy, fearing it is losing the upper hand, brings up the battleships Kongo and Haruna to shell the airfield. The shelling continues through the 14th and destroys over 50 aircraft. The Japanese quickly take advantage of the interruption in American air cover and land 4,500 troops and large quantities of supplies west of the Marines' beachhead at Tessafaronga. While the Japanese are busy landing reinforcements for their upcoming offensive, the Marines are also getting some much-needed help. On the 13th, the U.S. Army's 164th Infantry Regiment lands on the island, boosting the U.S. contingent to 23,000. On 21 October, the long-awaited attack begins. The main thrust is made by the Japanese 2nd Infantry Division, which drives northward between the Lunga and Tanaru rivers toward the American beachhead. Secondary attacks are launched on the Marines' western flank across the Matanico. Much like their attacks on Bloody Ridge in September, the Japanese plan is poorly conceived and executed. The commanders have little or no intelligence about the location and disposition of the U.S. forces. They are also attacking from inland, which makes reinforcing their troops extremely difficult. U.S. artillery plays a crucial role in blunting the Japanese attacks. Advancing formations are decimated before they can effectively engage American troops. Even as their casualties mount, rigid Japanese commanders refuse to alter their tactics. They send wave after wave into the killing fields in front of the American positions. Although they are undoubtedly getting the best of the Japanese, the Americans too are receiving heavy casualties. Japanese artillery and tank fire take their toll, as does the increasingly vicious hand-to-hand combat. By 27 October, after a full week of vicious fighting, the offensive peters out and Japanese commanders call off the attack. They have suffered 3,500 casualties, including many of their best officers. Although the Americans, too, are exhausted, the situation on Guadalcanal has now drastically changed. The Japanese, who have until now chosen when and where to fight, have lost the initiative. The Americans, having won a decisive victory, are now preparing to launch their own major offensive, one which, they hope, will give them control of the island. And that may change forever the momentum of the war in the Pacific. 23 October 1942, for the second time in 2 months, outside the Egyptian town of El Alamein, the German and British armies face off against each other. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a man used to getting his way, has for weeks been prodding Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to attack the Nazi Africa Corps. Kibitzing by those not actually on the battlefield is a time-honored tradition, of course, and has, through history, created problems for frontline officers. Knowing that, Churchill accepts, in theory, the primacy of his battlefield commanders. Nonetheless, he sees in North Africa the opportunity to score an enormous victory, and he is impatient. Though Monty's hesitancy has frustrated Churchill, as he faces the Germans, the Field Marshal enjoys a tremendous advantage. He has insisted that he will not initiate a battle until his forces are numerically twice as strong as the defending Germans. Despite entreaties from above, Monty knows that time is on his side. Supplies and reinforcements flow freely to the British in North Africa, while the Nazis are having increasing trouble supplying the Africa Corps. The Germans are also suffering from back-of-the-lines kibitzing of their own. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the extraordinarily skilled commander of the Africa Corps, is in Europe for rest and rehabilitation. His defensive plans are being implemented from afar by General Georg Stumme. At 21:30 hours on 23 October, the German defenders hear the drone of British bombers passing high overhead, heading for targets deep behind the lines. 10 minutes later, Montgomery's 900 artillery pieces begin lobbing shells into the German forward positions. The Germans, having been lulled into complacency by Montgomery's hesitation and Rommel's departure, are taken by surprise. Stumme is almost instantly isolated from thousands of troops under his command, and within hours of the opening of the barrage, lies dead on the Saharan sands. The English press forward on a 6-mile front, braving entrenched Germans and unmapped minefields which take an enormous toll. By 24 October, Australians under Montgomery's command take Kidney Ridge, a line of high ground with a clear view of the German 15th Panzer Division. Rommel is ordered by his Führer to return to the battlefield, and upon his arrival in Africa on 25 October, sees that the situation is much more dire than he had been led to believe. If the Germans are to salvage anything from the battle, they need not only to hold the ground they still have, but also to recapture that which they have lost. Kidney Ridge, in particular, must be retaken. However, Rommel's troops have few tools to bring to bear on the British. Not only have German lines of communication largely been severed by the British artillery, but the Nazi tanks have almost no fuel with which to maneuver. They are left fighting an almost pure infantry battle, something for which they are outnumbered and ill-prepared. It is not long before the Australians, using Kidney Ridge as their starting point, punch a huge hole in German lines. On 31 October, Rommel notifies the Luftwaffe that they will soon be needed in an attack he himself will lead. He dispatches Stukas to pound the Australians on Kidney Ridge and drives the remnants of his 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions forward in a desperate counterattack. Incredibly, the attack works, plugging the hole in the German lines and allowing Rommel to momentarily consider an attack on Kidney Ridge itself. Montgomery finds himself looking less at victory than at the possibility of stalemate, exactly the outcome he feared as he rebuffed Churchill's entreaties to attack quickly. Dreading both an extension of the war in Africa and a long series of I-told-you-sos from London, Monty whips up Supercharge, an operation that will throw his armored reserves into action and hopefully break the backs of the Germans. The attack begins 2 November with an artillery barrage that drops more than 15,000 high-explosive shells on a front barely a mile wide. Infantry pour into the breach, with armor not far behind, and in a matter of hours, 3 British tank divisions are wreaking havoc behind German lines. Rommel, sensing the opportunity to kill scores of British tanks while risking few of his own, trains his devastating 88mm guns on the British. In no time, burning armor litters the battlefield. It appears that the Germans might well be on the verge of victory when flights of British bombers begin to swoop down on the 88s, picking them off one by one. By sunset, enough artillery has been silenced that the British positions behind German lines are secure. 30,000 German troops are dead or captured, and 2/3 of Rommel's guns destroyed. The Desert Fox, resigned to the inevitable, orders his remaining troops to withdraw. Der Führer, dispensing orders from the comfort of the German capital, berates Rommel for his prudence in cutting his losses, demanding instead victory or death. Rommel, with the blessing of his commander, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, ignores the kibitzing from the rear and pulls his forces back 120 miles to Mersa-Matruh. Montgomery takes a moment to indulge in a little back-of-the-line supposition of his own, thinking out loud that perhaps he should dispatch someone to capture Rommel. That, like Hitler's order to win or die, is easier said from the rear than done on the lines. November 1942, North Africa. In the early morning hours, a group of U.S. Army Rangers comes ashore near the port of Arzew, some 30 miles to the west of Oran. These Rangers are the spearhead of a massive invasion by Allied forces. Some 100,000 men, most of them Americans, divided into 3 separate task forces, begin to move ashore in an area of operations that spans some 500 miles. This is Operation Torch, the first major assault by U.S. ground troops against the Axis. In charge of the endeavor is an American Lieutenant General, Dwight David Eisenhower. In taking on the task, Eisenhower was aware that it would require much more than the organization and execution of a military action. If the plan were to succeed fully, British and American soldiers, from the command staff down to the men on the front lines, must abandon their military and political differences and act as a team. Now, as his troops begin to move ashore, Dwight Eisenhower will be given a chance to see, as few men ever are, just how successful his labors have been. At Azure, the rest of the 18,000 men of the Central Task Force begin to move ashore here and at Oran to the west. 3 regimental combat teams of the Army's 1st Division hit the beach and begin moving inland. Directly behind them, transports begin to unload some 180 tanks, which promptly join the battle. Thankfully for these men, Allied intelligence has been excellent, and the surprise is complete. Although there is some resistance, Axis troops in both cities soon run up the white flag. Contributing to the rapid surrender is the fact that these are not German soldiers. They are rather Vichy French, and while the government for which they bear arms is in cahoots with Hitler's Germany, many view the Germans as invaders of their homeland. While the troops here continue their push toward Oran, the men of the Eastern Task Force landing near Algiers find the going somewhat more difficult. While the task force is comprised primarily of British troops, the initial landing is made by the U.S. 34th Infantry Division. Eisenhower and his staff reason that the French may be more willing to surrender to American forces. It appears, however, that these French soldiers are none too willing to surrender to anyone. As the 6,000 Americans begin landing, French shore batteries fire on the invading troops. Soon enough, though, they are silenced when Allied warships offshore respond in kind. While the British forces begin to come ashore and join in the fray, the Americans continue to advance inland. By 8:30 a.m., French commanders along the coast are ready to negotiate a surrender. In Morocco, the Western Task Force is having the most difficult time of the 3. Unlike the other 2 groups, which traveled from English ports, the Western Task Group, operating under the command of Major General George S. Patton, sailed from the United States. Now, having survived the journey, the ocean they have just crossed seems unwilling to let them go ashore. As the landing craft move toward the beach, the turbulent sea batters them about. Many never make it. Once on land, things begin to look up. The French are totally unprepared. The city of Safi falls quickly, and soon after, Patton comes ashore. Reports filtering back to General Eisenhower at Allied Forces headquarters are by and large positive. Despite continued fighting, all 3 task forces have landed and are pushing toward their objectives. Perhaps more important, the combined land, sea, and air forces of the U.S. and Britain are functioning as a single, cohesive military force. Yet for all the good news, Eisenhower's gratification is diminished by the cruel realities that ultimately confront all military leaders. For along with reports of the initial successes, come reports of the first American men to sacrifice their lives in the battle against the Axis. Since America's initial landing on Guadalcanal, American commanders have discovered that the jungle-blanketed islands of the South Pacific will pose hazards and challenges for our soldiers, unlike any they have experienced before. Strategists must alter their tactics to fight in the alien landscape. Engineers must modify equipment to prevent destruction by the elements. And the men doing the actual fighting must accept the pervasive discomfort and sickness endemic to the jungle. It became clear very early on that winning the war in the Pacific would require not only special military skills, but special medical ones as well. The waterholes of the Pacific Islands carry the threat of dysentery. As a result, the medical officers preach a purifying gospel. Water purification tablets and distillation systems are shipped along with the first supplies after a beach landing. The islands are rife with disease. Typhoid, cholera, and yellow fever are among the least of the killers. By far the worst is the mosquito-spread blight malaria. The men take daily doses of Adipirin and quinine to head off infection and follow standardized mosquito avoidance procedures. Medics spend hundreds of hours hunting for the stagnant pools in which mosquitoes breed. When larvae are found, they spray the surface of the water with oil, both suffocating and poisoning the pests, before calling in bulldozers to destroy the breeding ground. As troublesome as the plants and insects are, the terrain of the islands poses even more of an obstacle to providing medical treatment. Delivery of supplies presents a massive logistical problem. The crates of pills, bandages, and precious plasma come in by airdrop, truck, mule, even on the backs of GIs. Even more daunting than getting supplies to medics in the jungles is the problem of getting wounded men out. The forces on any given island are spread across miles of land impassable on anything but foot. Medics must carry their fallen comrades out of harm's way on stretchers, a hard means of travel that only compounds injuries. Upon arrival at the battalion aid station, doctors examine the wounded and pin a man's medical information to his shirt with an emergency medical tag. Those who can be helped immediately receive attention and are sent back to the line. Others are sent on for further treatment. The most desperate are handled on the spot. Surgery is performed in makeshift operating rooms. Tents and dugouts are all these hospitals can offer to protect the men from further injury and infection. Those requiring more extensive treatment go to the collecting station and, if need be, to a hospital ship. There, expert medical care is available, as well as relatively peaceful time to recuperate. Only the most seriously wounded return home. The rest, once fully recovered, will rejoin their units at the front. Watching the men return to battle, one cannot help but be struck by the irony faced by the medics and doctors. If they do their jobs well and are successful in healing their patients, they can only watch in silence as the same men they have mended are thrust back in harm's way. Despite that, they approach their jobs with all the fierce intensity of a soldier in battle. They know that without the care that only they can provide, the Allied battle for the islands of the South Pacific is as good as lost.